973 LBC.
The Wi-Fi's down.
Breakfast on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
9 minutes before 8, come back to your reactions to the events developing in Ukraine. But for an update, we can't go to anybody better than Conservative MP and Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, who joins me now. Thank you for coming on, Secretary of State. What is the latest, as you understand it, in Ukraine? Good morning.
Good morning, Nick. So the latest of our assessment is that Russia has failed to take any of its day one objectives. They have lost about 450 members of the Russian armed forces. They've lost a number of tanks and armoured personnel. They've lost at least 3 fighter jets and helicopters. They have failed to break out of the Donbass, which, if you remember, was President Putin's so-called pretext of going there. They haven't been welcomed as liberators, which I think President Putin expected them to be, by the Ukrainian population. The Ukrainians have fought and fought bravely, and they continue to do so. And then, amazingly, as we all saw on the television screens, there have been protests in Russia in 56 cities. So there are some brave Russians out there who realize that they don't want this in their name either. So Ukraine is doing its best. We are continuing to support Ukraine in lots of ways, as is other members of the international community. I spoke to my defence counterpart about an hour ago, and I spoke to him late last night with the Foreign Secretary, and we will keep receiving their requests and keep doing everything we can to help them with them.
When you say doing everything we can, are we moving more kit or manpower over there, Secretary of State?
Well, I think now that it's, I'm afraid, Nick, as it's a sort of war zone going on, I have to be very, very careful with, other than to say we will continue to do everything we can. I think there is something quite interesting. There's an airport just to the north of Kyiv, which was a target for the so-called elite special forces, the Spetsnaz, who landed there in helicopters. I think you've probably seen some of the footage. They failed to take that airport. The Ukrainians counterattacked, took it back off them. And so in this short window, it shows the determination of the Ukrainians and the inadequacy of some of the Russians. The danger is, though, that President Putin's solution to this is more violence. And there's been heavy shelling and heavy use of missiles overnight. And that is, I suspect, the battle damage to civilian areas will be quite large when the sun comes up, which it is now doing, because that is how Putin and the Russians do their business.
As a military bloke, you won't need reminding of the fog of war, but I have to put you, there are reports from unnamed Ukrainian sources, military sources, that the Russians could be on the outskirts of Kiev by close of play today, Secretary of State. Have you heard those reports, and do you recognise that as a possibility?
There's lots of possibilities. If we looked at the massive odds that Russia posed before they started this with 160-odd thousand troops, you would have thought they'd have all done it in 24 hours. No one would have thought they would have failed to take a single one of their objectives, which is where we are now. It's one thing to drive down a road with a tank. It's a very different thing to try and take a town or a city. It's incredibly hard. That's where you get blown up. People use everything from small missiles to tank traps, etc. So I don't think the Ukrainians are going to be fighting in open ground. They know that the Russians have air superiority because that's what they've been flying about with. So I think there'll be a sense of let them come into the cities and then whack them.
On the subject of air superiority, I spoke with a Ukrainian MP earlier this morning, Secretary of State. She has armed herself with a Kalashnikov, but her call, and I'm going to quote directly, we need to step up, we need air cover. You just referenced that, Secretary of State. How likely is it that air cover, noting that Ukraine is not a member of NATO, can air cover be provided?
Well, it can be provided, and a number of states already are providing anti-air missile capability. The Stingers, some of the Baltic states provided Stinger missiles. For those of you of my and your age, you'll remember the Stingers in the Soviet Union and Afghanistan basically kicked the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan with Stinger missiles. So they are now in Ukraine, and they have been, I can't say directly, but those type of weapon systems will be able to bring down Russian air should they continue to invade. So we can do more around that. We don't have Stingers in the British Armed Forces stock. We do our air defence differently, but we can support others, and we will constantly look at all the requests. But it is absolutely the case we need to help them defend themselves in the air and defend themselves on the ground. But we're not going to be putting NATO aircraft into Ukrainian airspace. That would become a direct Russia-NATO fight that could trigger, I'm afraid, a war across the whole of Europe. The same goes for British forces. If I put British air onto Russian air, then we get into a big war.
Is it fair to characterise it, the way you've summed it up for a Secretary of State, Putin had a bit of a bloody nose yesterday, didn't he?
He didn't get his way, and he had a bloody nose in two ways. He didn't get his way militarily, despite all the boasting and the big forces, and he didn't get his way in his political beliefs or his legacy beliefs that he was really uniting the great peoples of Ukraine with his peoples, and that they would hail him as some sort of liberator. I think that's the very opposite of him, and I hope that what it does is feed the response that he will get a legacy from this. It won't be the one he wants. It'll be one that we'll decide in the international community.
Talking about what happens next, when I told my listeners you were coming on, a lot of people have emailed questions in. Amanda in Hampshire says, I'm taking my 15-year-old daughter to school and she's crying. She's convinced there's going to be World War III because she's been watching TikTok. How real is that? I can't answer that. Secretary of State, you're closer to it. Are we edging towards World War III for that 15-year-old?
I have a 12-year-old son who has been worried from early morning about these things because they live in a world that you and I didn't do with 24-hour media. TikTok, Twitter, and it makes everyone feel anxious. And I think that is why we have a moral obligation to stop this in whatever way we can or assist Ukraine, because the point about the social media and TikTok is the ripples get felt a long, long way away. The mistake in the 1930s was, no one had ever heard of the Czechoslovakia and it didn't really matter. Well, these things do matter and they come home. So what I can say to her is we are doing everything to not only support the Ukrainians, but also contain the Russian threat and make sure it does not escalate and that there is not a miscalculation. And I would say to her, difficult as it probably is for me, because I want to stand up to bullies, is that if Russia does things in other parts of the world, or indeed does things on its borders, such as in the Baltics, the first really duty is for us to effectively not confront by shooting down a Russian plane or anything else, but to avoid that escalation and to go through all the methods we can to make sure that doesn't happen, because I don't want a war across Europe as much as anybody else. So we are putting our extra forces in Eastern Europe deliberately to contain, but also to reassure those smaller countries so they don't have to react in a way that could be more aggressive. So that's what we're doing all the time to do that. And in order to sort of keep me right and keep the others right, I share that with the other politicians in the other parties. I've literally just spoken to Keir Starmer doing the media round as I walked around the corridors, because we've got to make sure we do this together. And so I have just like my children, I think about your ladies' children as well. So we're going to do that, but we are going to stand up to this bully.
I just wonder, and this is possibly hoping for the impossible, could there be a greater degree of responsibility from some social media outlets, Secretary of State?
Well, I've always felt that. I was security minister. I watched them, help spread propaganda of Daesh, and people got radicalised in their bedrooms because there never seemed to be any responsibility. I think you should get Nick Clegg on your show. He's now one of the heads of Facebook, and ask him. But also, I have to say that the hope the Ukrainians are feeling is at the moment delivered by social media platforms in their country. That if you were a Ukrainian being told the Russian forces are invincible, and there were lots of people in the West thinking that, you only have to go on social media to say, not invincible, not at all.
Lastly, how disappointed were you that would appear the European Union did not assist the United Kingdom, and I understand the US, in moving to get Russia out of what's called SWIFT, the economic service system?
Well, there's still time. It's not a one-off, and I know the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister is going to NATO today, or he's going to speak to NATO leaders virtually. There's still time to work to do that. This has to cost.
Well,
Putin.
this is a key part of our armour, isn't it, Mr. Wallace? Potentially.
It is, and we're trying. But the SWIFT is a multinational organisation. I think it's based in Belgium, so we have to keep working to get that. The other sanctions that we announced yesterday, asset freezes, banks, etc., they are some of the strongest sanctions I've ever seen in my time in politics against Russia. And the challenge is to make sure we stick at it way after this crisis passes.
Always good to have you on your show. Thanks very much indeed for your time. Defence Secretary Ben Wallace appearing here on LBC. We're at 8 o'clock. The news is with Thomas Watts.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, Ukraine has warned Russian